A 13-year-old girl was the only one that survived after the plane she was on crashed when they were moments away from landing. This investigation would reveal several shocking details about the reckless mistake the pilot made, and that's why we're going to look at what happened that led to this terrible tragedy. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story begins when 5 passengers boarded a private jet at the LaGuardia Airport in New York to take a short flight to the Fitchburg Municipal Airport in Massachusetts. The aircraft they were flying in was a Beechcraft B200 King Air. This is a twin turboprop aircraft with a T-tail configuration, and one of the biggest challenges to the investigation was that there was no flight data recorder on board the aircraft because it wasn't something that was required. Additionally, even though the aircraft had a cockpit voice recorder, it didn't record any audio from the flight, and the NTSB couldn't determine if it broke prior to the crash or because of the impact. One of the passengers on the flight was Anthony Fisher, but most people called him Tony. If you ever served in the military, then you might be familiar with the Fisher name because Tony's uncle, Zachary Fisher, was the one responsible for creating the Fisher House Foundation, and Tony sat on the board of directors, and he was a big philanthropist. Traveling with Tony was his wife, Ann Fisher. Before her marriage, Mrs. Fisher worked in the fashion and magazine industry. The Fishers had 5 children, but their 13-year-old daughter, Tora Fisher, was the only one traveling with them on this trip, and tragically, she would be the only one to survive the crash. The 2 other passengers flying with the Fisher family were 36-year-old Michael Campanelli and 50-year-old Thomas Fox. They were both interior designers who were helping to renovate the Fishers' vacation home. The pilot-rated passenger sitting in the right seat of the aircraft was 30-year-old Eric Jacobson. Eric had a commercial certificate with a multi-engine rating and almost 1,100 hours of total flight time. However, he only had 4 hours in the make and model of aircraft they were flying when they crashed. The man they all trusted to get them safely to their destination was 49-year-old Robert Monaco, also known as Bobby. He was the pilot in command in the left seat. Bobby had been a professional pilot for almost 25 years, and he had an airline transport pilot certificate, and he was also a flight instructor with about 6,100 hours of total flight time, including about 1,300 hours in the King Air 200. In my opinion, one of the most frustrating aspects of this debrief was just how shocking it was to find out that despite how much experience Bobby had, he still made a very reckless mistake. Now, I cover a lot of tragedies on this channel, and it's important to keep in mind that the purpose of a pilot debrief is to try to remove the emotion from the debrief. That way, instead, we can focus on the lessons that we can learn that might help save someone else's life. But in order to do that, we need to start by taking a look at the plan. The night before the crash, Bobby started working on the flight plan, and he called the local flight service station and requested the weather forecast for the route of flight. The original plan was for him and Eric to fly from Bedford, Massachusetts up to LaGuardia, where they would pick up the 5 passengers and fly them back to Bedford. On the morning of the crash, Bobby called flight service around 6 a.m. to get the weather for LaGuardia and Fitchburg, while Eric called and got the weather for Nantucket and Bedford. Bobby also requested pilot weather reports for icing and turbulence, and my guess is that Bobby was concerned about a low pressure system that was moving into the area because according to the investigation, the area forecast covering Fitchburg called for overcast skies from 700 to 1,400 feet, and visibility would be from 1.5 to 5.5 miles in fog, freezing rain, and light snow across the region. There were also numerous reports of light to moderate icing at low altitudes, but the NTSB didn't mention these in its final report. And that's probably because the King Air is approved for flights in known icing conditions, and it should have been able to handle any icing in flight. So as far as we know from the details provided by the investigators, icing did not play a role in this tragedy. I thought Bobby made a good decision to review the weather at multiple airports because he probably wanted to know what all of his options were in case he needed to divert somewhere. Anytime you're not certain about the weather, you need to look at the big picture of what's going on around your destination and make sure you have a backup plan. The reason why this is important is because after Bobby picked up the passengers at LaGuardia, the plan started to change. They originally departed on an IFR flight plan back to Bedford, but shortly after getting airborne, Bobby amended their destination to Fitchburg. According to Tora Fisher, the intent was to drop off 2 passengers at Fitchburg, and the pilots would continue with the remaining passengers to Martha's Vineyard. The flight to Fitchburg didn't take very long, and just after 9 a.m., Bobby checked in with the approach controller, and that's when things started to go wrong. Before we look at the air traffic control transcripts, I want to point out that even though Eric was a pilot and he was in the right seat, the NTSB always referred to him as the pilot rated passenger throughout their final report. That means he probably didn't have a type rating in this aircraft and he wasn't required to. The King Air 200 only requires one pilot to operate, and because it was Bobby's voice on the radio, my guess is that Eric was just along for the ride so that way he could build up some hours and experience. However, that doesn't mean he's just supposed to sit there and stay quiet. He should have been an active part of the flight crew, but unfortunately, since we don't have the cockpit voice recorder, we'll never know for sure what was said between the two pilots. As they got closer to Fitchburg, the aircraft was flying at 5,000 feet, and when Bobby checked in with the controller, he requested to fly the GPS approach to runway 14. According to the controller, Bobby was going to be the first aircraft to fly into the airport that morning. The reason this is important is because Bobby doesn't have any way of knowing how low the clouds are over the airport other than the forecast he got a few hours ago. However, there was nothing wrong with him flying the approach to see if he could get below the weather. The flight was conducted under Part 91 rules, which aren't held to the same safety standards as Part 135 and Part 121, which are your private charter and commercial airline flights. Part 91 rules allow for a pilot to fly an instrument approach to essentially look and see if the weather is good enough to land. However, they still have to honor the altitudes on the approach, and according to the GPS approach to runway 14 that Bobby was using on the day of the crash, the lowest he could fly was 1,320 feet MSL. That's about 1,000 feet above ground level. But keep in mind that the forecast was for overcast skies as low as 700 to 1,100 feet. This means there's a chance that Bobby can get below the weather, but he should have carefully reviewed the approach and been prepared to execute the missed approach procedure if he couldn't. He should also be using Eric to help him out by verifying the altitudes and calling for the missed approach if necessary. Eric might not have had a type rating in this aircraft, but he had an instrument rating and he should have been able to help. Regardless of what happened in the cockpit, all we know for certain is that about 90 seconds later, Bobby was told to cross the Gardner VOR at 5,000 feet, and he was cleared for the approach. Everything seemed to be going fine until he got to the final approach fix. Before we see what happened next and what the 13-year-old survivor had to say, we first need to talk about the most shocking part of this entire tragedy. According to hospital records, Bobby was seen in January of 2002, over 1 year prior to the crash. He presented with symptoms of head-to-toe body aches, explosive headaches, episodes of not knowing where he was, and he had a history of seizures. During that visit, he got a spinal tap and he was diagnosed with viral meningitis, and he was taking a drug called Tegretol, which is used to control seizures. About a month and a half later, when he turned in his application for an FAA medical certificate, he indicated that he wasn't using any medication, he didn't have any history of seizure, and he claimed he hadn't visited a health professional in the last 3 years. In my opinion, lying about your medical condition so you can keep flying is an extremely reckless decision, and as a 25-year professional pilot, Bobby should have known that this decision was putting himself and everyone that he flew with at risk. But to make matters worse, Bobby would continue to get prescriptions filled for Tegretol and a drug called imipramine for over 1 year leading up to the crash. But despite Bobby's apparent declining health, he never reported any of these issues to the FAA, and that's probably because he knew it would mean that he'd have to stop flying until he got better. If that's not bad enough, about 2.5 months before the crash, Bobby was examined for multiple abscesses on his upper body. He refused treatment, saying that he needed to work the following day, and the doctor warned Bobby about the risk of flying with his condition. 5 days later, Bobby had a staph infection growing out of his right arm, and then 2 weeks later, which was just 2 months before the crash, Bobby went to the emergency room after he fell off some stacked boxes while he was washing his airplane. The ER entry stated he had a history of seizures. According to the investigation, Bobby's toxicology report revealed morphine, antidepressants, and anti-seizure medications in his system, the combination of which could cause drowsiness and lack of coordination. And now that you understand that Bobby never should have been flying the plane, we need to talk about why the plane crashed and what the survivor had to say about what happened during the final moments of the flight. The GPS approach to runway 14 is a non-precision approach. That means there isn't any vertical guidance for the pilot to follow to descend to the runway like there is on an ILS approach. Instead, what Bobby needed to do was comply with the altitude restrictions, and when he got to this point right here, which is 3.1 nautical miles from Olive, he would begin a descent to 1,320 feet MSL. That's the minimum descent altitude for the approach, and if he can see the runway, then he just continues visually to land, but if he gets to Olive and he still doesn't see the runway, then he's supposed to execute a missed approach. According to radar data, Bobby crossed Kanat at 2,800 feet and an average ground speed of 120 knots. Then he descended to 1,600 feet in accordance with the approach. However, when he was 3.1 miles from Olive, he should have continued down to 1,320. Instead, he just stayed level at 1,600. Because he leveled off above the MDA, this was going to make it harder to get below the weather, and it would likely result in a steeper approach angle once he got the runway in sight. Unfortunately, we'll never know what really happened when Bobby got to Olive. It's possible that he finally started to see the runway because a witness reported seeing the aircraft fly directly over runway 14, going in and out of low scattered clouds. Bobby would continue to descend to the MDA, but by the time he got there, he was over the south side of the airfield, and it looked like he was setting up for a left downwind to runway 32, landing the opposite direction he was going. I think that Bobby was trying to fly a circling approach, and that means he was using the GPS approach to get below the weather, and now he would just keep the runway in sight and make a left turn back towards the runway to land. However, in order to do this, you need to have adequate spacing from the runway, and that was going to be hard to achieve with low ceilings and limited visibility. As Bobby kept descending, he eventually started a left turn back to the runway, but he was so close that he needed to increase the bank angle to make the turn, and unfortunately the aircraft stalled and crashed. According to the investigation, based on the aircraft weight and configuration, at a bank angle of 45 degrees, the stall speed would be 104 knots. If you increase the bank angle to 60 degrees, the stall speed increases to 123 knots. Bobby's airspeed indicator at the crash site had the needle pegged at 60 knots, and Eric's airspeed indicator was pegged at 66 knots. 13-year-old Tora Fisher was the only one to survive the crash. She said she remembered the airplane turning to the left and described the maneuver as going almost completely upside down before rolling out and then starting another steep left turn. She also told the NTSB that she had flown with the pilot before and knew that he liked to make sharp turns. The truth is that even if Bobby wasn't taking all of those drugs, trying to make sharp turns at a slow speed in a landing configuration in the traffic pattern is a reckless mistake in my opinion, because you can easily stall the aircraft and you don't have enough altitude to recover. This was a terrible tragedy and Bobby never should have been flying the plane. As a result of his choices, 6 lives were lost, a 13-year-old survived, and she and her siblings would never see their parents again. And my heart goes out to everyone that was affected by this event. When it comes to reckless mistakes, there was another King Air tragedy where the pilot was taking off and the co-pilot yelled out, "You just lost your left engine." The pilot tried to save the aircraft, but it continued rolling to the left, crashing nearly inverted just 17 seconds after takeoff, killing everyone on board. But the shocking truth was that there was nothing wrong with the engine. So be sure to click here to see the reckless mistakes that led to that terrible tragedy.